Today, we see the cross as a symbol of faith, redemption, and sacrifice, worn by billions around the world. But in the ancient world, this simple shape meant only one thing: terror. It was the ultimate expression of state power, a calculated display of agony designed not just to kill a person, but to destroy them in body, in name, and in memory. This was crucifigere, to fix to a cross. This was crucifixion. The Romans did not invent crucifixion. The practice was likely learned from the Carthaginians, who may have learned it from the Persians. But it was the Romans who perfected it. They transformed it into a complex, legal, and bureaucratic system of capital punishment. The great Roman orator Cicero called it the most cruel and disgusting punishment. And he was right. It was so horrific that, by law, a Roman citizen could almost never be crucified, regardless of their crime. Citizenship was a shield against this specific horror. Crucifixion was a punishment reserved for the lowest of the low: rebellious slaves, pirates, traitors, and provincial non-citizens. It was known as the servile supplicium, the slave's punishment. Why was it so brutal? Because the goal of crucifixion was never a quick death. The goal was deterrence. A crucifixion was a piece of public theater. It was a billboard, written in blood, placed along major roads or at the gates of a city. It was a message from Rome to every person who passed. This is what happens when you defy the power of the empire. This is what happens to those who are not us. The aftermath of Spartacus's slave revolt in 71 BC is the most infamous example. After crushing the rebellion, the general Crassus had 6,000 of Spartacus's followers crucified. Their crosses lined the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome, for over 120 miles. For weeks, travelers were forced to walk past this forest of agonizing, dying men. The message was clear. So what actually happened? What was the process? It is vital to understand that the crucifixion itself was only the final act in a long process of torment. The ordeal began not at the cross, but at the whipping post. This was the verberatio or scourging. The condemned was stripped naked and tied to a post. Then the lictors, the state executioners, would go to work. They used a tool called a flagrum or flagellum. This was not a simple whip. It was a handle with multiple long, leather thongs, and tied into these thongs were sharp pieces of metal, lead balls, or jagged fragments of sheep bone. With every lash, the flagrum would rip open the skin, tear at the muscles, and expose the bone beneath. The goal was not to punish, but to maim. It was designed to induce massive blood loss and send the victim into hypovolemic shock. Many men died from the scourging long before they ever saw the cross. If the victim survived, they were forced to begin their final walk. This is where a common misconception appears. We often imagine the condemned carrying a complete 10-foot-tall cross. This is highly unlikely. A full-sized hardwood cross could weigh over 300 pounds, or 135 kilograms. A man who had just been scourged to the brink of death could not lift it. Instead, the victim was forced to carry only the patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam. This beam, typically weighing between 75 and 100 pounds, about 35 to 45 kilos, was placed across the victim's shoulders and tied to their outstretched arms. They were then paraded through the city, naked, bleeding, and surrounded by soldiers. This was the final humiliation. Often, a sign called a titulus, detailing the man's name and his crime, was hung around his neck or carried ahead of him. When they reached the execution site, often a hill outside the city walls, like Golgotha in Jerusalem, the place of the skull, the process was chillingly efficient. The vertical beam, called the stipes, was often a permanent fixture, a simple post already set in the ground. The victim was thrown onto their back. The soldiers would stretch their arms across the patibulum they had just carried. And then came the nails. The Romans used long, tapered iron spikes, about 5 to 7 inches long and square at the top. Another myth is that the nails were driven through the palms of the hands. This is anatomically wrong. The flesh of the palm cannot support the weight of a human body. The skin would tear through. Instead, the executioners drove the nail through the wrist, in the small space between the two bones of the forearm, the radius and the ulna. When the nail was hammered into this spot, it would sever or put agonizing pressure on the median nerve. This is the large nerve that runs to the hand. The resulting pain is indescribable. A searing, blinding, white-hot agony that would shoot up the arm with every beat of the heart. Once both wrists were secured to the patibulum, the beam, and the man attached to it was hoisted up and fixed onto the stipes, the vertical post. Then they secured the feet. Sometimes the feet were tied with rope. More often, they were nailed. The victim's legs were bent at the knee, and a single, long nail was driven through both feet, one overlapping the other, fixing them to the front of the stipes. And then they waited. The true genius and the true horror of crucifixion was the mechanism of death. A crucified person did not die from the nails. They did not die from blood loss, though they were bleeding profusely. They died from suffocation, asphyxiation. When hanging by the arms in this position, the body's entire weight pulls down on the chest and the diaphragm. The muscles used for breathing are stretched to their limit. The victim can inhale, but they cannot exhale. The lungs fill with air, but the body cannot expel the carbon dioxide. Panic sets in. To take a single breath, to exhale, the victim had to do the only thing they could: push up. They had to push their entire body weight up using the single nail driven through their feet. This would relieve the pressure on their chest for just a moment, allowing them to gasp for air. But pushing on that nail sent a new wave of excruciating pain through their body. And the movement would scrape their back, which had been torn open by the flagrum, against the rough wood of the stipes. This was the entire rhythm of crucifixion. A slow, agonizing cycle. Push up to breathe, collapse in pain. Push up to breathe, collapse in exhaustion. This could last for hours. Sometimes it lasted for days. The victim was exposed to the elements. The burning sun, the freezing night. They were swarmed by insects, which would feed on their open wounds. They suffered from profound dehydration, muscle cramps, and delirium. All the while, they were publicly mocked by crowds and guarded by soldiers. Sometimes, a small wooden block called a sedile or seat was nailed to the stipes. This was not an act of mercy. This small ledge allowed the victim to support themselves slightly, preventing their wrists from tearing free. It was designed to do one thing: prolong the agony. When it was finally time to end it, the Romans had a simple method. It was called the Crucifixion. A soldier would take a large iron club or hammer and, with one or two blows, shatter the victim's shin bones. With their legs broken, the victim could no longer push up to breathe. The end came quickly. Unable to lift themselves, the victim would rapidly suffocate, their lungs locked, and they would die. Their body was often left on the cross, to be eaten by birds and wild animals. Denying a proper burial was the final act of degradation, a damnation of the soul as well as the body. This was the servile supplicium. It was a system of death engineered for maximum pain, maximum humiliation, and maximum political impact. In the 4th century AD, the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, finally abolished crucifixion throughout the Roman Empire. He did so out of reverence for Jesus Christ. In one of history's greatest ironies, the tool that had been the ultimate symbol of Roman terror and imperial dominance was transformed, forever, into a symbol of faith and salvation.